Oats stretched a quarter pound of beef into 6 patties. Grape jelly turned meatballs into the most requested potluck secret of the 60s. Iowa steamed its beef loose and called it a sandwich. None of this got written down. Here are 30 cheap ground beef meals we stupidly stopped making. Johnny Marzetti arrived in American kitchens through the back door of a Columbus, Ohio restaurant in the 1920s. And by the time anyone outside Ohio thought to ask about it, half the Midwest had been eating it for years. Italian immigrant Teresa Marzetti opened her restaurant in 1896 near Ohio State University and developed a baked casserole of ground beef, tomato sauce, noodles, and cheddar that sold for 45 cents a plate. The Columbus Public Schools put it on their menus, then spread it statewide. A proper Marzetti was baked, not stovetop. In the oven, the flavors married, the cheese browned at the edges, and the noodles along the bottom got that appealing crustiness everyone wanted but wouldn't say so. You learned to take your serving from the edge of the dish if you got there first. Teresa's recipe appeared in the Columbus Dispatch as early as 1916, spread through church cookbooks and community potlucks until the whole Rust Belt knew her name, and now most people under 50 have never heard of it. The restaurant closed in 1972. Stretcher patties were the Depression's most honest recipe, a name that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. When meat rationing during World War II limited each adult to 2.5 pounds of beef per week, home cooks developed a technique for making 1 pound behave like 2. Mix it with rolled oats, crushed crackers, or grated potato, then season aggressively enough that the filler disappeared into the flavor. Pressed thin and fried in cast iron until the outside crisped and the inside stayed tender, they didn't taste like compromise. They tasted better than a plain burger in ways that took years to understand. Gladys Klein of Burlington, Wisconsin, remembered making them through the war years. The oats absorbed the beef juices as they cooked, trapping a depth of flavor the all-beef version couldn't match. When rationing ended and thick patties became affordable again, stretcher patties vanished almost overnight. A generation of cooks took their knowledge of what oats could do for ground beef, and when they left the kitchen, the knowledge went too. Grape jelly meatballs were the 1960s best-kept potluck secret, and the rule was simple. You never told anyone what was in the sauce until after they'd had seconds. Equal parts grape jelly and chili sauce into the pot. The meatballs simmered in that sweet, sour purple glaze until they turned glossy and tender, and the whole thing went into a crock pot you could carry across town. Every woman who made them swore the recipe was too embarrassing to share. Every woman who tasted them begged for it. The chemistry was real. The jelly's pectin thickened the sauce, the fruit's acidity cut through the fat, and the result tasted like nothing you could name but couldn't stop eating. Church socials, baby showers, and neighborhood suppers from the late 1950s through the 80s all had a crock pot of these somewhere on the table. When someone finally asked what was in the sauce and you told them, you watched the same expression cross every face: disbelief, reconsideration, and the slow reach back for another one. That expression was the whole point. Calico beans got their name from the coat of a calico cat, the way 3 or 4 kinds of beans and browned meat created a patchwork of colors in the baking dish that looked, if you squinted, like something that was actually pretty. Ground beef browned with bacon and onions, then combined with canned pork and beans, kidney beans, and butter beans in a sauce of ketchup, brown sugar, cider vinegar, and mustard, baked until it bubbled and thickened at the edges. By the 1960s, this dish was a fixture at church potlucks, summer cookouts, and county fair covered dish suppers from Wisconsin to Kansas. It stretched a half pound of beef into something that fed 20 people and held heat for hours. Ideal for the long drive to the fairgrounds. You brought it in a cast iron Dutch oven if you had one, a covered casserole if you didn't, and the pot came back empty every single time. These days, calico beans have slipped off the menu almost everywhere that isn't a Midwestern church basement, replaced by dishes that take more effort and feed fewer people with less warmth. If calico beans were the centerpiece of the Midwestern potluck table, the loose meat sandwich was what Iowa built its food identity around. And if you called it a sloppy Joe within earshot of someone from Sioux City, you would hear about it. The story starts in 1924, when Dave Heglin began selling seasoned, loose ground beef at Ye Old Tavern in Sioux City. No patty, no sauce, scooped onto a steamed bun with mustard, pickles, and onion. 2 years later, butcher Fred Angel opened the first Maid-Rite in Muscatine, steaming his beef in a proprietary dark liquid and letting the crumbly, juicy result spread through Iowa with the persistence of something that knows exactly what it is. You ate it leaning over the counter because it fell apart the moment you picked it up. And that was not a flaw. That was the point. 2 distinct tastes in every bite, the old-timers said, and neither translated to any other preparation. The woman who drove 40 minutes out of her way to stop at the Marshalltown Maid-Rite on every road trip took that habit with her, and the children she raised elsewhere grew up without it. Hamburger soup was what happened on the days when there wasn't quite enough of anything. A half-pound of ground beef browned with onions, then whatever the garden was giving up or the icebox needed to clear, potatoes, carrots, celery, green beans, a can of tomatoes, added with enough water to cover everything and left to simmer on the back burner all afternoon. The broth thickened from the potato starch. The beef broke into smaller pieces until it spread through every spoonful, and by supper time the kitchen smelled like it had been cooking all day, because it had. There was no recipe. The recipe was the pot, the heat, and whatever needed using up: salt, pepper, sometimes a bay leaf. By the 1950s, this soup still showed up every time the week got long and the refrigerator got thin, not because money was short, but because the instinct to make something from almost nothing had been practiced so long it felt like knowledge. She made it without measuring, without looking at anything but the pot. The version you make from a recipe never tastes like the version she made from a Tuesday. The miners who ate slumgullion in the California gold rush camps of the 1850s probably didn't enjoy it much. The name, from words meaning slime and cesspool, wasn't meant to flatter. But the idea behind it, a flexible stew of whatever meat, vegetables, and starches were on hand, simmered together until they became more than their parts, traveled through every lean decade, and arrived in Depression-era kitchens as a genuine weeknight staple. Ground beef browned with onion, mixed with canned corn and tomatoes and crackers or pasta, simmered until the crackers dissolved into the broth and thickened it from the inside. Every family had a different name for it. Some called it goulash, some slumgullion, some just called it supper. One woman who learned it in the middle 1930s remembered it being made with bacon and very little hamburger. Better the next day after the flavors blended. You didn't measure it, you didn't follow steps. The ability to walk up to an open refrigerator and see a meal was what it taught. It faded when pantries got fuller and the urgency went with them. Hamburger cornbread bake showed up in the 1940s as a direct result of wartime arithmetic. Beef was rationed, cornmeal was not. Ground beef browned with onion and seasoned simply, salt, pepper, a can of creamed corn stirred in for moisture, spread into a cast iron skillet, then covered with a poured cornbread batter slightly looser than usual, thin enough to flow around the edges and seal the meat underneath. In the oven, the batter puffed and browned into a crust that absorbed the fat and juices rising from below, so the bottom of the cornbread was savory in a way the top never was. You served it by scooping rather than slicing, the crust breaking apart over the filling, the steam catching you before you got the first bite to your mouth. The technique became standard in Southern and Appalachian kitchens through the 50s and 60s, passed along without a recipe card because the women who made it baked cornbread often enough that they could pour the batter without measuring. The ones who could do that aren't here to teach it now. The beef-filled biscuit ring was the dish that made ground beef look like it had somewhere important to be. Seasoned beef and cheese was tucked into flattened biscuit dough rounds, each one pinched shut and placed seam-side down in a ring around the inside of a bundt pan, the rolls pressed together so they'd bake into a connected crown you could pull apart at the table. Better Homes and Gardens ran variations through the 1960s and 70s because it photographed beautifully, and because in an era of covered dish suppers, a dish that looked impressive while costing almost nothing had real social value. The trick was in the pinching. If the seams weren't tight, the filling escaped into the pan, which ruined the visual but generally improved the flavor. Every household that made this had one person who couldn't seal a biscuit properly, and one person who took over that job without being asked and never let anyone forget it. The ring came out golden and puffed, the filling visible at the seams, and the first person to grab a section always pulled too hard and took half the ring with them. Nobody minded. Long before the biscuit ring filled pans in the Midwest, Volga German immigrants were already folding ground beef into dough along the Nebraska and Kansas prairie, calling it bierok or runza, depending on which family you asked. The filling was beef and cabbage, chopped cabbage wilted into browned beef, seasoned with caraway if the cook was traditional, salt and pepper if she wasn't, sealed inside soft yeasted dough and baked until the outside turned golden and the filling steamed itself into tenderness inside. These settlers brought the recipe to Nebraska and Kansas in the early 20th century and spread it the way all important recipes moved, through hands, not paper. A Nebraska woman who grew up eating them through the 1940s could tell, just from the weight of one in her hand, whether the dough-to-filling ratio was right. When the Runza restaurant chain opened in Lincoln in 1949, it gave the sandwich a consistent commercial shape, but the home version, heavier, a little uneven, was something the restaurant could approximate but never quite match. That version left with the women who made it. Mock prime rib patties were the Depression's most theatrical invention. Ground beef shaped and scored to look like something expensive, served to people who hadn't seen a real rib roast in years and weren't going to anytime soon. The technique was deliberate. A pound of ground beef mixed with onion and seasoned firmly, shaped into an oblong loaf with a rounded top, then scored in a crosshatch that browned in the oven to mimic the crust of a standing rib roast. Sliced at the table with the scored surface facing up, it looked, to anyone who wanted to see it that way, like something that had cost real money. These were the kitchens of women who understood that dignity at the table mattered as much as the food itself, and that a meal which looked like abundance was better for the spirit than one that advertised its own poverty. Some cooks inserted half rings of raw onion into the scored grooves before roasting. The onion caramelized into the surface layer and sweetened it. That technique, humble beef made to carry its head high, was a skill and a form of pride. It faded with the memory of why it had ever needed to exist. Haystacks were invented in Iowa in the 1950s by Ella Mae Hartline, and the origin story makes complete sense the moment you hear it. She and her husband had lived in Arizona, loved tostadas, and when they moved back to Iowa, tostadas weren't something you could find. So she built a version from what was available: seasoned ground beef, canned beans, shredded cheese, diced tomato and onion, layered on saltine crackers or corn chips, and called it a haystack because of how it looked when assembled, the layers tumbling up into a loose pile. The dish spread through Iowa potlucks and church dinners with the speed of something that requires no skill, accepts any preference, and scales from 5 to 50 with equal ease. By the 1970s, it had developed regional variations: Hawaiian versions with chow mein noodles, church versions with Velveeta, cafeteria versions with whatever was in the pantry. But the base was always layers, ground beef, and the pleasure of building your own plate the way you wanted it. Nobody makes it anymore because nobody has the church supper to bring it to. Chow mein hot dish emerged from Minnesota church kitchens in the 1960s as one of the Midwest's more unlikely inventions. Ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and celery baked in a deep dish and finished with a layer of crunchy chow mein noodles from a La Choy can. The noodles came from Chinese-American cuisine, the cream soup came from Campbell's, the beef came from the freezer, and the combination worked, the noodles staying crisp on top while softening slightly at their undersides where the steam reached them. Minnesota home cooks knew the trick. You never stirred the noodle layer into the casserole, you laid it across the top in the last 15 minutes and pulled the dish the moment the edges began to curl. Church cookbooks from the Twin Cities ran versions through the 60s and 70s as if it were as natural as anything else on the table. It faded when La Choy went out of fashion, and the idea of Chinese pantry staples in a beef casserole started to seem stranger than it had in 1968. The woman who knew when to pull it from the oven isn't making it anymore. Beef and olive casserole showed up at church ladies' luncheons and covered dish suppers in the 1950s and quietly divided every room between people who understood it and people who didn't. Ground beef, browned with onion, folded into cream of mushroom soup with a full can of sliced black olives, poured over egg noodles and baked until the edges crisped. The olives were not decoration and not optional. Their briny, meaty quality lifted the whole dish past ordinary, and they had to cook into the beef, releasing their oil into the pan and softening while the casserole set around them. This was insider knowledge. The women who made it correctly had figured out that black olives and ground beef had a natural sympathy tracing back to Southern European immigrant kitchens. The women who substituted or omitted were making something else. The dish disappeared quietly when the black olive became a pizza topping rather than a casserole staple. Before the casserole dish took over the American dinner table, whole families spent Sunday afternoons over heads of cabbage, and the result was stuffed cabbage rolls, a tradition that Polish cooks called gołąbki, Ukrainian families called holubtsi, and every community that encountered it eventually adopted under whatever name felt most like home. Ground beef mixed with raw rice, grated onion, salt, and pepper was spooned onto a softened cabbage leaf, rolled tight, and nestled in a baking dish with tomato sauce poured over the top. The rice expanded inside the rolls as they cooked, absorbing the tomato and beef fat until the whole roll held together in a way that seemed improbable, given how loosely it had started. The technique required patience and hands that knew how tight was tight enough. Women who had made them since childhood could roll 50 in the time it took someone learning to roll 5. The recipe arrived with the immigrants, traveled through church basements and community halls until it was standard American home cooking, and stopped when the immigrants' grandchildren stopped making Sunday food. Tater. Tot hot dish belongs to Minnesota the way gumbo belongs to Louisiana, a dish so embedded in the culture that Minnesotans don't explain it, they just bring it. Ground beef browned with onion and green beans, mixed with cream of mushroom soup, spread into a baking dish, then covered completely, not partially, completely, with a single layer of frozen tater tots before going into the oven. Ore-Ida introduced tater tots in 1953, and Minnesota church cooks adopted them into the hot dish tradition almost immediately. The crust that formed on the underside of each tot where it met the beef layer was the part everyone wanted. Part potato, part gravy, crisp on top and soft underneath. You had to leave the tots in a single even layer and not crowd them, or they steamed instead of crisped. That's the kind of thing you learned by watching, not reading. These days, tater tot hot dish survives mostly at Minnesota church potlucks, which is exactly where it belongs. Hamburger spoon bread casserole was the Southern kitchen's answer to how to make 1 pound of ground beef feel like a full table. Spoon bread itself, a loose, custard-like cornmeal dish baked until it puffed and set, too soft to cut, served with a spoon, had been part of Southern cooking since before the Civil War. Sometime in the 1940s, some practical cook figured out that spreading seasoned ground beef in the bottom of the baking dish before pouring the batter on top produced something better than either dish alone. The beef released its fat upward into the batter as it baked. The batter absorbed it and held it. And what came out of the oven was a cornmeal crust that tasted like it had been cooked in the pan with the meat because it had been. Scooped onto a plate, the 2 layers separated naturally, browned meat underneath, soft golden crust above, and the whole thing needed nothing else. The hamburger version that made spoon bread a weeknight staple has largely vanished, the way the thriftiest versions of everything always vanish first. Burger bundles were the 1960s dinner party trick, and the trick was this. You pressed a cavity into a large raw meatball, packed in a scoop of boxed stuffing, Pepperidge Farm if you had it, sealed the beef back around it, and presented what looked like an oversized meatball but opened at the table to reveal a bread-stuffed interior nobody had seen coming. Women's magazines and covered dish supper circuits ran the recipe through the mid-60s because the reveal at the table, cutting into something ordinary and finding something unexpected inside, created exactly the kind of conversation that kept guests talking. The stuffing absorbed the beef juices as everything baked, the exterior browned and held its shape, and the moment someone cut one open and asked what was in it, the cook had the answer and the room. It was a dish with a sense of humor built into its construction. Nobody makes them now, partly because the dinner party itself has largely gone the way of the bundles. She started it the night before, always the night before. The beef went into a heavy pot with onion, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables needed using, corn, peas, green beans, and simmered until the broth reduced into the kind of gravy that coated the back of a spoon. In the morning, she poured it cold into the baking dish and left it in the icebox until an hour before supper, then mixed the biscuit dough by hand and dropped it in spoonfuls across the top. What came out was not a pot pie. The crust was too rough for that, too honest. And not a stew, though the filling ran when you served it. The biscuit dough baked over beef gravy made the kind of supper that required a bowl, not a plate, and a spoon wide enough to get biscuit and filling in the same bite. She knew that. She always knew that. Long before the biscuit cobbler came down from the stove, a different kind of ground beef was being pressed thin in the Mississippi Hill Country. And while the name was not designed to attract customers, the price was. The slug burger was born in Corinth, Mississippi during the Depression. A 5-cent fried patty of ground beef stretched with soy flour, pressed thin as a pancake, and dropped into a cast-iron skillet of hot lard until the edges went crisp and the interior stayed just tender. The soy flour created a crust that plain beef couldn't match, thin, crispy-edged, slightly chewy at the center. 5 cents bought a sandwich with pickles and mustard, and along that stretch of Highway 72 through the 30s and 40s, it bought you a meal when nothing else was affordable. The technique of stretching beef with soy flour was common across the Depression South, but Corinth made it a local institution. The city has held an annual slug burger festival since 1988. The patty still served at local diners the way it was during the Depression, with pickles, mustard, and a bun. It is the only burger in America named for its own price. Hamburger biscuit pinwheel rolls lived in the intersection of clever and practical, and the kitchens that made them were the same ones that figured out nothing needed to go to waste if you thought about it carefully. Biscuit dough rolled flat, covered with seasoned ground beef and shredded cheese, then rolled up tight and sliced into rounds. The rounds going cut side down into a greased baking dish and baked until the biscuit puffed and the filling set inside each swirled slice. Pillsbury's refrigerated biscuit dough made this easier when it became widely available in the 1960s, which was when the dish spread beyond households that made their own biscuits. The trick was in the rolling. Too loose and the filling fell out during slicing. Too tight and the biscuit couldn't rise. The cook who'd made them 20 times knew exactly how firm to roll without thinking about it. The first-time cook always rolled too loose and served rounds with a beef and cheese crater instead of a swirl. Both tasted fine. Beef and kraut casserole was the dish that German immigrant communities brought quietly to American potluck tables, and American potluck tables quietly accepted. Ground beef browned with onion, folded with well-drained sauerkraut, caraway seed, and enough sour cream to bind everything into a thick, tangy filling. Baked until the edges browned, and the kitchen smelled like something that had been cooking in a farmhouse for 100 years because, more or less, it had. German settlers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the upper Midwest had been making versions of this combination since the early 19th century, the sauerkraut providing the acid that cut through the fat, the caraway threading a flavor through the dish you tasted even when you couldn't identify it. By the 1950s, it was a potluck staple in communities where German surnames still outnumbered the others. By the 1980s, it had faded from most tables as those communities dispersed, and their grandchildren cooked from different cookbooks. The recipe card survives in a lot of families. The person who knew it by heart does not. Homemade beef aroni predated the Chef Boyardee can by decades in the kitchens that mattered. Ground beef browned with garlic and onion, mixed with elbow macaroni cooked just short of done, folded into tomato sauce, seasoned with oregano and a pinch of sugar. The sugar, the detail that separated the cooks who knew from the cooks who didn't, baked until the top layer of macaroni crisped and the sauce below stayed loose and red. The canned version arrived in 1965 and within a generation replaced the homemade one because the can was cheaper in time and tasted close enough for children who'd never had the real thing. The homemade version had a depth the can couldn't touch. The beef rendered into the sauce, the macaroni absorbing it, the whole dish cohering in a way that required an actual pot and actual attention. The woman who made it from scratch on Wednesday nights because Wednesday needed something reliable isn't making it anymore. Corn chip casserole, Frito pie bake, some families called it, or just the Fritos casserole, was the 1970s most democratic potluck dish. Ground beef seasoned with chili powder and cumin, layered with canned chili beans and corn, covered with shredded cheddar, and topped with Fritos crushed lightly so they held their shape through the first 15 minutes of baking before softening into the cheese and beef beneath. The Fritos both seasoned and structured the dish. Their corn flavor deepened the chili layer, their salt made additional seasoning almost unnecessary. School fundraiser cookbooks from Texas to Kansas carried some version of this through the 70s and 80s. It was the dish people brought when they needed to feed 30 on short notice and wanted everyone to be happy about it. Those 30 people are scattered now. The dish went with them. Before the backyard grill became the centerpiece of the American summer, the oven did the work. And in the Depression years and long after, a sheet pan of ketchup-glazed meat patties was the kind of supper that required nothing but time and a bottle of Heinz. Ground beef mixed with onion and crackers, formed into oval patties, painted with ketchup before going into a hot oven, the ketchup caramelizing as they cooked, darkening at the edges, sweetening the surface until the exterior tasted nothing like the bottle it came from. It was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was the thing you made when you were tired, when the week had been long, when you had ground beef and 30 minutes and children who needed feeding. She made it without looking at anything, without measuring anything, without thinking about it as cooking. You can follow every step exactly right, and the result will be close. It will not be the same. Beef dumpling soup was the kind of dish that required an afternoon and a grandmother, and most people only ever had one of each. Ground beef seasoned with onion and parsley was rolled into small, tight balls, compact, firm dumplings that held their shape in the broth, dropped into clear beef stock and simmered through. The dumplings absorbed the broth as they cooked, becoming tender from the outside in, carrying the stock flavor into their centers. In Eastern European and German immigrant households across the upper Midwest, this was winter food. The first thing that appeared when someone was sick. The last thing on the stove when the day was cold. You had to know how tight to roll the dumplings so they didn't fall apart in the broth. Nobody had to tell you. You watched until you knew. The soup stopped appearing on tables when the people who made it stopped appearing at them. Rag mop casserole earned its name the honest way. It looked like a mop had been through the pan and nobody had bothered to clean up after. Ground beef browned and broken into the smallest possible pieces, mixed with canned cream-style corn, ranch-style beans, and enough cheddar to hold everything in a loose, rough-textured mass that spread across the baking dish without forming any particular shape. The dishevelment was the point. No visual presentation, no pretense that it was anything other than filling and cheap and done in one pan. Women who made it knew that breaking the beef fine, smaller than crumbles, almost shredded, was the technique that distributed the meat through every bite rather than sitting in chunks above it. Church fundraiser cookbooks from East Texas and Louisiana carried recipes for it under names like cowboy casserole and ranch skillet bake. The name rag mop was more accurate than any of them. Stuffed grape leaves with ground beef appeared in Greek and Middle Eastern immigrant households across American cities from the 1890s onward, and the women who made them, the Yayas in Astoria, the Sidis in Detroit and Dearborn, treated them as ordinary Tuesday food rather than the delicacy the rest of the country imagined them to be. Ground beef mixed with rice, fresh mint, and allspice was rolled into young grape leaves picked from backyard vines while still tender enough to fold, then braised slowly in lemon and water until the rice swelled inside each roll and the leaves darkened to olive. The allspice was the signature, a single spice that read as exotic to anyone outside the tradition and as simply correct to anyone inside it. What the immigrants understood was that ground beef inside a grape leaf was not a luxury dish. It was a way of making a little meat feed many people elegantly, with flavor that cost nothing but knowledge. That knowledge is harder to find now. Hungarian-American beef goulash, the real kind, not the American pasta tomato version, arrived in Pennsylvania mill towns and Cleveland neighborhoods with the Central European immigrants of the early 20th century and tasted nothing like anything else in the American kitchen. Ground beef browned until dark, simmered with onion, sweet paprika, and beef broth until the sauce reduced thick and rust-colored, finished off the heat with sour cream stirred in at the last moment, the sour cream smoothing the paprika's richness into something ancient and specific. The paprika had to be Hungarian, the old cooks said, and they were right. The Hungarian variety had a sweetness and depth American paprika couldn't touch. The sour cream could not go into a boiling pot or it would break. You added it after the heat was off, stirred fast, and served immediately. These were the rules. They are still the rules in the few kitchens where anyone still follows them. The last thing in a long day of cooking was sometimes a baked potato, split and stuffed with whatever ground beef was left in the pan, seasoned simply, nothing wasted. Leftover beef went back into the skillet with onion, and whatever seasonings felt right was spooned into the hot potato, covered with a slice of American cheese, and set under the broiler until the cheese melted down into the beef. It cost almost nothing. It took almost no time. It fed the children without complaint, which on a Thursday was enough. The potato gave the meal a shape, something that looked like dinner rather than leftovers. The same logic that had driven every cheap and practical ground beef dish on this list. Nothing wasted, no one going hungry. The beef stretched to the last person at the table, and the woman who stretched it never once made it seem like anything less than supper. Shepherd's pie without the lamb was how American grandmothers adapted the British classic to budgets and tastes. Ground beef was browned with onions and mixed with whatever vegetables were available: peas, carrots, corn, green beans, then spread in a baking dish and topped with mashed potatoes. The whole thing baked until the potatoes turned golden brown and the filling bubbled up around the edges. Grandmothers made this when they needed one dish to serve as the entire meal, complete with meat, vegetables, and starch. The mashed potato topping could be piped fancy for company or simply spread with a fork for Tuesday supper. Families ate it straight from the baking dish, scooping portions that included every layer. The dish used up leftover mashed potatoes and any vegetables that needed cooking. 1 pound of beef beneath all those potatoes and vegetables fed 8 people satisfied. This was the cooking of women who never wasted anything. Spanish rice with beef brought color and warmth to tables during decades when exotic flavors meant anything beyond salt and pepper. Ground beef was browned with onions and green peppers until the vegetables softened. Then rice was added along with canned tomatoes, water, and seasonings like chili powder and cumin. The mixture simmered covered until the rice absorbed all the liquid, turning fluffy and fragrant with each grain tinted orange from the tomatoes. For seniors living alone, this one skillet meal meant dinner and tomorrow's lunch from a single cooking session. The recipe was forgiving: a little more water if the rice seemed dry, a little longer cooking if needed. The dish appeared in countless community cookbooks throughout the South and Southwest, where frugal cooks understood that ground beef stretched furthest when surrounded by vegetables and grains. Each forkful delivered protein, vegetables, and starch in perfect balance, a complete meal that cost pennies per serving. When General Mills launched Hamburger Helper in August 1971, ground beef had just climbed to 66 cents a pound, and the box promised to stretch 1 pound into a meal for 5. The first flavors, beef noodle, potato stroganoff, chili tomato, hash, and rice oriental, sold so fast that within 12 months, 27% of American households had bought at least one box. But thousands of home cooks had been making their own versions from scratch for years. The homemade method was nearly identical. Brown a pound of ground beef with diced onion, stir in dry pasta, add water or broth with paprika, garlic powder, and onion salt, then simmer until the noodles absorbed the liquid and turned thick. A handful of shredded cheddar stirred in at the end finished it. The scratch version cost less and tasted better, but convenience won the decade. By 1975, the Helping Hand mascot, a 4-fingered talking glove, was as recognizable as Betty Crocker herself. Stuffed cabbage rolls carried old-world traditions into American kitchens where ground beef met resourcefulness. Grandmothers blanched whole cabbage heads until the leaves softened enough to peel away, then filled each leaf with ground beef, cooked rice, onion, and seasoning. The rolls were tucked snugly into Dutch ovens, covered with tomato sauce stretched from canned tomatoes. Hours of slow baking transformed the rolls into tender parcels where the beef melded with sweetened cabbage and tangy sauce. One head of cabbage and a pound of beef could feed a family for 2 days when the rice stretched the filling properly. Eastern European immigrant families brought these recipes in their memories, adapting them without ever writing anything down. The rolls appeared at Sunday dinners and holiday tables, marking special occasions without breaking the budget. Leftover rolls reheated beautifully, often tasting better the second day. This was the food of grandmothers who remembered scarcity. Beef and cabbage skillet was the thrifty cook's answer to stretching a half-pound of meat into a meal that could feed 4 or provide days of leftovers. Ground beef was browned with onions until fragrant, then shredded cabbage was added by the handful until the skillet seemed impossibly full. As the cabbage cooked down, it released moisture that created a natural sauce, wilting into sweet tenderness while the beef seasoned every strand. A splash of vinegar or tomato sauce added brightness, while salt and pepper brought everything into focus. For seniors with gardens or access to farmers' markets, cabbage was one of the cheapest vegetables available, a single head lasting weeks in the refrigerator. The dish required only one pan and minimal attention, cooking down while seniors rested or tended to other tasks. Eastern European immigrants brought versions of this recipe to America, but it became beloved across all communities that valued humble ingredients. The result was filling, nutritious, and deeply satisfying. What do you do when you need to feed 12 people on $1's worth of meat? You make calico beans. The dish got its name from the patchwork of colors: dark red kidney beans, pale butter beans, white navy beans, and pork and beans all tumbled together with browned ground beef, diced onion, and a sweet tangy sauce of brown sugar, vinegar, mustard, and ketchup. It stretched a half-pound of hamburger into a crowd-sized dish where nobody felt shortchanged. Slow baked for an hour until the top caramelized and the juices thickened, calico beans became a potluck institution across Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Some families added bacon for smokiness. Others stirred in extra canned beans for body. It earned its place at the Fellowship Hall table by proving flavor had nothing to do with price. Beef and noodle casserole was the covered dish that showed up at every church potluck and neighborhood gathering. Ground beef was browned with onions, combined with egg noodles and canned cream of mushroom soup, then baked until bubbling and golden on top. The soup created a creamy sauce that held everything together while the noodles absorbed those beefy flavors. Crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs went on top for crunch, turning a simple casserole into something children fought over. This was the dish grandmothers made when feeding a crowd or when grieving families needed meals delivered. The casserole traveled well in foil-covered pans and reheated without losing its appeal. 1 pound of beef stretched to serve 12 when the noodles and soup did their work. Families relied on it for weeknight suppers assembled in minutes. The recipe existed only in memory, adjusted each time based on what the pantry held. Texas hash combined the bold flavors of the Southwest with the practical economy that Depression-era cooks passed down through generations. Ground beef was browned with plenty of onions and green peppers. Then rice was added along with canned tomatoes and chili powder, enough to give heat without overwhelming. The mixture was transferred to a baking dish and cooked until the rice turned tender and the flavors married into something cohesive and satisfying. For seniors living alone, Texas hash offered the advantage of a complete meal that improved with reheating, each day the spices deepening and the textures mellowing. The dish appeared in community cookbooks from Texas to Ohio, adapted by cooks who understood that regional names mattered less than solid technique and affordable ingredients. 1 pound of ground beef could provide nearly a week of solo dinners, each serving hearty enough to satisfy without anything more elaborate. Simple seasonings applied with confidence created meals worth remembering. Cowboy casserole carried the swagger of the American Southwest straight into suburban kitchens of the early 1970s. The dish layered browned ground beef with canned baked beans, barbecue sauce, and shredded cheddar, then crowned everything with refrigerated Pillsbury biscuit dough before the whole thing went into the oven until golden. It thrived in the Midwest and South, showing up at school cafeterias, 4-H suppers, and anywhere families gathered with big appetites and small budgets. Some versions folded in diced tomatoes or taco seasoning. Others kept it simple, just beef, beans, and biscuits, the holy trinity of weeknight survival. The biscuit top was the genius, puffing up to create a golden lid that sealed in all the smoky, beefy steam underneath. Kids tore into it without being told twice, and adults went back for seconds without apology. Poor man's steak transformed ground beef into something resembling expensive cuts families couldn't afford. A pound of beef was mixed with crushed crackers, egg, and seasonings, then shaped into oval patties meant to mimic sirloin steaks. These patties were dredged in flour and fried until crusty on the outside, then smothered in onion gravy made from the pan drippings. The crackers stretched the meat while keeping the patties tender and moist inside. Served alongside mashed potatoes, this meal gave working families the feeling of abundance without the price tag. Fathers sat at the head of the table cutting into their poor man's steak with pride. The gravy was essential, turning simple fried patties into something that felt celebratory. Grandmothers shaped these patties with hands that had made thousands before, never needing a recipe card. The dish appeared on payday when spirits were high and on lean weeks when creativity mattered most. American goulash bore little resemblance to its Hungarian namesake, but generations of American cooks loved it anyway for its hearty simplicity. Ground beef was browned with onions and garlic, then combined with elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and tomato sauce in one large pot. The pasta cooked directly in the liquid, absorbing all the meaty tomato flavor, while the sauce thickened around it. Seasonings varied by household. Some added Italian herbs, others preferred chili powder. Still others kept it simple with just salt and pepper. For seniors living alone, this dish was a revelation in efficiency. One pot, 1 hour, and enough food to last most of the week. The recipe appeared under different names in different regions: Slumgullion, Hodgepodge, Johnny Marzetti, but the principle remained consistent. Modest ingredients transformed through slow simmering into something greater than their parts. The dish was democratic food, equally welcome at church suppers and quiet dinners for one. Before it became cafeteria food, Johnny Marzetti had a proper origin story. Teresa Marzetti, who ran a restaurant near Ohio State University in Columbus, created the dish in the early 20th century and named it after her brother-in-law. By the 1970s, the recipe had migrated so far from its restaurant roots that most people just called it that noodle casserole. The formula was ground beef browned with onions and green peppers, stirred into cooked elbow macaroni with canned tomato sauce, then topped with shredded American cheese and baked until bubbling. School cafeterias across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan served it by the tray, and PTA cookbooks listed it more often than almost any other main dish. What set it apart from generic hamburger noodle bakes was the green pepper. That slightly bitter crunch against soft noodles and rich meat sauce gave it a character plain casseroles lacked. At roughly 12 cents a serving in a school kitchen, it fed hundreds of children daily. Beef and macaroni skillet was the one-pan wonder that got dinner on the table in 30 minutes flat. Ground beef was browned in a large skillet, then dry elbow macaroni was added right into the pan along with canned tomatoes, water, and seasonings. The whole thing simmered covered until the pasta turned tender and absorbed the tomato beef liquid into something rich and saucy. No separate pot for boiling pasta, no draining, no extra dishes to wash afterward. This was the meal grandmothers made when time was short and children were hungry and patience was wearing thin. The skillet went straight to the table where families served themselves from the pan. 1 pound of beef and a box of macaroni fed 6 hungry mouths without complaint. Seasonings varied by household. Some added oregano and garlic. Others kept it simple with just salt and pepper. The dish was forgiving of distracted cooks and hungry children sneaking bites before dinner was called. Hamburger gravy over rice was the weeknight lifesaver that kept seniors fed when energy and grocery budgets ran low. A half-pound of ground beef was browned in a cast-iron skillet, then sprinkled with flour and stirred until it formed a thick paste. Milk or water was added slowly, stirred constantly, until the mixture transformed into rich, creamy gravy seasoned with salt, pepper, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce. The gravy was ladled generously over leftover rice, creating a meal that was filling and deeply satisfying. For seniors living alone in the 1950s and 1960s, this dish represented security, knowing that a little meat and pantry staples could produce something substantial. The recipe required no fancy ingredients, no complicated techniques, just patience at the stove. Children who visited their grandparents often remembered this dish served in heavy ceramic bowls, the gravy pooling around the rice, steam rising in quiet kitchens where love was measured in simple meals. The smell hit you before you saw the chafing dish, sweet, tangy, faintly smoky, with a glossiness that caught the light from across the room. Grape jelly cocktail meatballs were the unlikely star of every 1970s dinner party, baby shower, and neighborhood open house. The recipe sounded absurd. 1 jar of grape jelly, 1 bottle of Heinz chili sauce, and a batch of small ground beef meatballs, all simmered until the sauce reduced into a sticky, jewel-toned glaze. The jelly melted into the chili sauce and created something neither could achieve alone, a sweet, savory coating that clung to each meatball like lacquer. Guests speared them with colored toothpicks and ate standing up, leaving purple-tinged sauce spots on paper napkins. The recipe circulated through women's magazines and community cookbooks throughout the early 70s, credited to nobody in particular because everybody seemed to already know it. They cost almost nothing and disappeared from the tray within minutes. Hamburger soup was the answer to cold evenings when seniors needed something warm and nourishing without standing at the stove for hours. Ground beef was browned with onions and celery, then covered with water or broth and combined with whatever vegetables were available: canned tomatoes, diced potatoes, carrots, green beans, corn. The soup simmered until everything melded together, the beef releasing its flavor into the broth while the vegetables softened. Seasonings were simple: salt, pepper, bay leaf, perhaps a pinch of thyme if the pantry allowed. For seniors, this soup represented the ultimate in practical cooking, a single pot that produced meals for an entire week, reheating even better than it tasted fresh. The recipe adapted to whatever needed using up, making it perfect for stretching resources and avoiding waste. Churches and senior centers often served versions of this soup at gatherings, knowing its warmth could comfort grieving widows and lonely elders alike. Every spoonful carried the essence of home cooking. Before fondue became a punchline about 1970s dinner parties, it was a genuine cultural phenomenon, and ground beef played a bigger role than most people remember. The Better Homes and Gardens, Fondue and Tabletop Cooking book, reprinted 9 times by 1972, included recipes for fondue bourguignon that called for cubed steak, but budget-conscious hosts quickly adapted the concept for ground beef. They shaped seasoned hamburger into small, tight balls, barely bigger than a marble, and set them beside the pot of hot oil for guests to spear with long forks and cook tableside. The sizzle and pop of each meatball hitting the oil was half the entertainment. Dipping sauces lined the table: horseradish cream, cocktail sauce, mustard, and something called zippy sauce that seemed to appear in every fondue recipe of the era. The whole production turned a pound of ground beef into an evening of entertainment. Fondue sets were the wedding gift of the decade, and for a brief, glorious stretch of the early 70s, cooking your own dinner at the table felt like the height of sophistication. Hamburger gravy poured over biscuits was the meal that made empty pantries feel abundant. Ground beef was browned in a skillet, then flour was sprinkled over the meat and stirred until it coated everything evenly. Milk went in slowly, stirred constantly until the mixture thickened into rich, creamy gravy studded with seasoned beef. The gravy was ladled generously over split biscuits baked fresh or pulled from yesterday's batch. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings needed, though some grandmothers added a dash of sage. This dish cost pennies, yet delivered satisfaction that expensive meals couldn't match. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on the day. Farm families ate it before dawn chores, while city families stretched it across weeknight suppers. The gravy could be thinned with more milk to feed extra mouths when company arrived. Children scraped their plates clean while parents exchanged knowing glances about the budget. The aroma of green peppers softening in tomato sauce filled the kitchen with a smell that was equal parts savory and slightly sweet. And for families in the early 1970s, it meant stuffed green pepper casserole was in the oven. The original stuffed peppers required careful hollowing, blanching, and individual filling, which was more fuss than most weeknight cooks could manage. So somebody, the credit has been claimed by dozens of community cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Nebraska, had the genius idea of deconstructing the whole thing into a casserole. Diced green peppers, browned ground beef, cooked rice, canned tomato soup, and shredded cheese all went into a baking dish together, layered or stirred depending on the household. 30 minutes at 350 degrees produced the same flavors without the architecture. The casserole version fed more people, reheated better, and didn't collapse on the plate the way individual stuffed peppers always seem to. It was a perfect example of how 1970s home cooks valued practicality over presentation. Poor man's stroganoff brought a touch of elegance to modest kitchens without the expensive cuts of beef that traditional recipes demanded. Ground beef was browned with onions until fragrant, then combined with cream of mushroom soup straight from the can, a convenience that made this dish accessible to seniors who found elaborate cooking exhausting. Sour cream was stirred in at the end, creating a tangy richness that elevated the humble ingredients. The mixture was served over egg noodles cooked soft, the creamy sauce clinging to every strand. For seniors in the 1960s and 1970s, this recipe proved that budget cooking didn't mean sacrificing flavor or dignity. A single pound of ground beef could provide leftovers for several dinners when cooking for one. The dish appeared at potlucks and church suppers, where widows and widowers shared their versions, comparing notes on whether to add paprika or mushroom pieces. It was comfort food that carried memories of better times. Few people today remember that rice-a-roni, the San Francisco treat, as the jingle promised, was the backbone of countless ground beef skillets in the early 1970s. Golden Grain had been selling the boxed rice and vermicelli mix since 1958, and by the 70s, home cooks had figured out that browning a pound of ground beef and stirring it into a prepared box of beef-flavored rice-a-roni created a one-pan dinner in under 20 minutes. The vermicelli toasted golden in butter before the liquid went in, giving the whole dish a nutty depth that plain rice couldn't match. A can of cream of mushroom soup folded in at the end turned it into something almost luxurious, creamy and rich where the original was simple and brothy. Topped with shredded cheddar and a scattering of French's fried onions, then baked for 20 minutes, it became a casserole that families served proudly at potlucks and neighborhood suppers across suburbia. Beef and potato hash was the weeknight miracle that turned yesterday's potatoes into tonight's hearty supper. Grandmothers would dice leftover boiled potatoes and fry them in bacon grease until the edges crisped golden brown, then crumble in ground beef seasoned with salt, pepper, and a shake of paprika. The mixture sizzled together in cast iron skillets until the beef browned and the potatoes absorbed those savory drippings. Onions went in early, softening and sweetening as they cooked down. This wasn't fancy food. It was survival food that tasted like home. Families of 6 could eat well on a pound of meat when it was stretched with cheap potatoes from the root cellar. Fathers came home from factory shifts to find this waiting on the table. Children grew up associating that smell of crisping potatoes and browning beef with security itself. Nothing was measured, nothing written down, yet it came out perfect every single time. Porcupine meatballs earned their peculiar name from the rice that poked out like quills after cooking, a visual trick that delighted children and reminded seniors of simpler times. Ground beef was mixed with uncooked rice, chopped onion, salt, and pepper, then shaped into balls and nestled into baking dishes. Tomato soup diluted with water was poured over the top, and the whole thing baked slowly until the rice absorbed the liquid and the meatballs turned tender. The rice expanded during cooking, creating that signature prickly appearance while stretching a half pound of meat into a full meal. For seniors cooking alone, this dish was practical magic. One pot, minimal cleanup, and enough food for several days of reheating. The tomato sauce gave everything a tangy sweetness, while the rice provided bulk that made the dish genuinely filling. This recipe survived in church cookbooks passed between neighbors who understood that ingenuity and economy made the best meals. Loose meat sandwiches fed entire Midwestern towns before fast food chains existed. Ground beef was crumbled into skillets and cooked until browned, then seasoned with onion, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, and sometimes a spoonful of mustard stirred right into the meat. The mixture stayed loose and crumbly, never bound together like meatloaf, giving it a texture that was uniquely satisfying. Spooned onto soft hamburger buns and topped with pickles and yellow mustard, these sandwiches became the affordable alternative to proper hamburgers. Small-town diners and church basement suppers served them by the hundreds. A single pound of beef made enough filling for 8 sandwiches when stretched properly with onion. Working families relied on them because the filling could be made ahead and reheated without losing quality. Children begged for them at school functions while parents appreciated how far the meat stretched. This was community food that brought people together over something simple. Hamburger steak with onion gravy elevated a simple beef patty into a proper dinner worthy of the dining table. Ground beef was shaped into thick oval patties, seasoned generously, then pan-fried in a cast-iron skillet until browned on both sides but still juicy inside. The patties were removed while sliced onions were cooked in the remaining fat until golden and soft, then flour was sprinkled over to create the base for gravy. Broth or water transformed the mixture into rich brown gravy that was poured over the patties and simmered until everything melded together. For seniors who remembered when eating out meant white tablecloths and proper service, this dish brought restaurant dignity to the home kitchen. The gravy stretched a small amount of meat into a filling meal, especially when served alongside mashed potatoes that soaked up every drop. This recipe survived because it made ordinary ground beef feel like a special occasion. American chop suey had nothing to do with Chinese cooking, but everything to do with feeding hungry families cheaply. Ground beef was browned with onions and celery, then combined with elbow macaroni and canned tomatoes in one big pot that simmered until everything melted together. The dish went by different names. Some called it goulash, others called it slumgullion, but the principle was always the same. Stretch the meat with pasta and vegetables until a single pound fed 8 people comfortably. Grandmothers adjusted based on what was available, adding green peppers when the garden produced or leaving them out when money was tight. The tomato base could come from fresh tomatoes, canned sauce, or even ketchup thinned with water. Families gathered around kitchen tables with big serving spoons, filling bowls with this stew-like mixture. Children grew up thinking this was gourmet food because it was served with such love. The recipe required no measuring, just instinct passed from mother to daughter. Cowboy beans with beef combined the heartiness of baked beans with the protein punch of ground beef, creating a one-pot meal that satisfied the deepest hunger. Ground beef was browned with onions, then canned pork and beans were added along with barbecue sauce, brown sugar, mustard, and a splash of vinegar for tang. The mixture simmered until thick and glossy, the beans absorbing all the meaty, sweet flavors, while the beef added substance that plain beans could never match. For seniors, this dish represented economical cooking that stretched resources without sacrificing satisfaction. A single batch could last nearly a week, improving with each reheating as the sugars caramelized and the flavors deepened. The recipe appeared at potlucks and church suppers throughout the South and Midwest, where cooks competed quietly to see whose version earned the most compliments. Served with cornbread or over rice, cowboy beans with beef proved that simple ingredients combined with care created meals that nourished both body and soul. The story goes that Ella Mae Hartline fell in love with tostadas while living in Arizona during the 1950s, and when she moved back to Iowa, where tortillas were nearly impossible to find, she improvised. What she created, layers of crushed saltine crackers topped with seasoned ground beef, shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, cheese, and sour cream, became known as haystacks. And by the early 1970s, the dish had spread through Mennonite and Seventh-day Adventist church communities across the Midwest. The beauty was the assembly line. You set out bowls of each ingredient and let everyone build their own. Children loved the freedom. Adults loved that it fed 30 people with 2 pounds of hamburger and a mountain of cheap toppings. Some congregations served haystacks so frequently that members joked they could build one in their sleep. The dish sat somewhere between taco salad and nachos, belonging to neither tradition but borrowing from both. Communal eating at its most democratic, where no two plates looked alike. These kitchens are quiet now, and the women who ran them are gone. Leave a comment with the dish that stopped showing up at your table. Somebody else misses it too.